In this video, we're going to talk about physically based shading. This discussion will serve as an overview to PBR with a goal of providing a base foundation to build upon. We'll start by looking at PBR from a general standpoint, and in the next video, we'll look specifically at Unity's implementation. So to start, what is PBR? I describe it as a method of shading and rendering that provides a more accurate representation of how light interacts with surfaces. PBR can be used for realistic as well as completely stylized assets. The method merely provides a workflow for authoring content based on real-world data. PBR has some key benefits. For instance, it's much easier to create materials as it removes the guesswork of authoring surface attributes because values are based on real-world data. This allows the artist to focus more on creativity rather than technical aspects. Materials will look correct in all lighting conditions, and finally, it provides a workflow for creating consistent artwork even between different artists. Here's an example of a PBR asset in Substance Painter, and you can see that by changing the environment map, I can actually change the lighting. So here I'll switch to a drastically different environment, and you can see that the material values still remain consistent regardless of the lighting. For instance, metal still looks like metal. Now, there are different workflows and implementations when it comes to PBR shaders. There isn't a real set-in-stone standard, so you will see variation from application to application or engine to engine. When I say workflow, I'm referring to the method through which you author the textures and the inputs the shader supports. Here, I'm referring to metal rough or specular glossiness workflows. In terms of implementation, I'm referring to any variations an engine might use. For instance, some engines pack the maps for efficiency or may use glossiness instead of roughness in a metallic workflow. You'll see variations between engines. However, the basic principles are the same, and we are still working with PBR data, which when used correctly and with a PBR shader that is correct, is consistent across the board. Now, there are actually two main workflows, which are metallic roughness and specular glossiness. Substance Designer supports both workflows, and Substance Painter officially supports metal rough, although you can grab a specular gloss shader from the Substance Share. Unity supports both workflows as well. When you start a PBR project, you will need to decide which workflow you will use to author your textures. This is often dictated by the game engine you're using and the workflow implementation it supports. In the case of Unity, it supports both workflows. However, it has a different implementation of these workflows. In the next video, we will look specifically at Unity's PBR implementation. But for this video, we're just going to take a look at the basics of these two workflows, and for the map creation guidelines, I will be focusing specifically on metal rough. Okay, but first, let's take a look at the two workflows together as a very basic overview. I'd like to state that even though these workflows are different, the end result is the same. You are still using the same PBR data, and when the correct data is used, you should get identical results as the two shaders should be using the same PBR code. In many ways, it really comes down to personal preference. Myself, I tend to like metal rough, and again, with Unity and Substance, you have access to both workflows. Starting with metal rough, you have three main maps: base color, roughness, and metallic. Both workflows use ambient occlusion, normal, and height, where the height map is used as an optional parallax effect. So the base color map contains two pieces of information: diffuse reflected color, which is also referred to as albedo, and metal reflectance values. The metallic map works like a mask, where white denotes metal and black denotes non-metal. The shader looks at the metal map, and for the white areas, it goes back to the base color and takes the values in the corresponding area, again denoted as white in the metal map, and uses that for the metal reflectance value. For the dark areas, the shader looks at the base color again and uses those values as diffuse reflected color or albedo. Metal reflectance and albedo will be covered specifically when we get to the map authoring guidelines section of this video, but for now, we're just looking at it from a high-level overview. The roughness map represents the microsurface of the material. It denotes if a surface is either rough or smooth. A rough surface will cause a highlight to spread out and appear to become more dim, whereas a smoother surface will focus the highlight. However, it's important to understand that the same amount of light is being reflected. Now, let's take a look at specular glossiness. This workflow involves three main maps: diffuse, glossiness, and specular. The diffuse map contains only diffuse reflected color, or albedo. Since the refracted light is absorbed, the color tint of metals come from the reflected light, and thus, in our diffuse map, we don't give metals a diffuse color. Areas that represent metallic surfaces are set to black. The specular map contains both the reflectance values for dielectrics, or nonmetals, and metals. You may have noticed in the metallic workflow, we don't have a method for authoring reflectance values for dielectrics in a map as we do here in the specular glossiness workflow. In the metallic workflow, the reflectance value for dielectrics is hard-coded in the shader to be 4% reflective. We do not have immediate control over the value as we do here in the specular map. Finally, we have the glossiness map, which is the same as the roughness map, with the only difference being that its values are the inverse, meaning that the glossiness map is just an invert of the roughness map. Now that we have discussed the two main workflows, here we can detail their differences. The metallic workflow has a base color map, which represents diffuse reflected color and metal reflectance. The metal map acts as a mask to denote metal and nonmetal. Dielectric reflectance, or more specifically stated as Fresnel at zero angle, or F0, is hard-coded in the shader at 4%. We'll discuss dielectric F0 in more detail later in the video. However, it's important to note that some metal rough implementations offer a specular input to the shader, which allows you to override this 4% value. In Substance Designer, you can do this with the metal rough shader by supplying a value to a specular level output. At the recording of this video, Unity doesn't yet offer this control in their metallic workflow shader. For the specular workflow, we have full control over dielectric F0 as we can author it directly in the specular map, and the specular map contains values for both metal and dielectrics. The diffuse map only contains diffuse reflected color, or albedo values. Now, if you're having trouble still understanding what albedo is, just think of it as the color of the surface that we see. It's the wavelength that is reflected back to our eyes, like the red skin of an apple. So I've mentioned that choosing a workflow can mostly come down to personal preference, and in the case of Unity, you have both options available to you. Let's now discuss some pros and cons to each workflow so you can get the full picture of both workflows. The pros of metallic are, it can be easier to author as you don't have to worry about dielectric F0 values. This also makes it less prone to user error by utilizing incorrect values. Also, it uses less texture memory as we are using one RGB map, which is the base color, and two grayscale maps, which are the rough and metal. And finally, it seems to be the more widely adopted workflow. It's the default shader in Substance, as well as Unity, and it's the only option available in, say, Unreal Engine 4. For the cons, we have the issue of no control over the dielectric F0. The biggest issue is that you can get white edge artifacts where bright metals and darker dielectrics meet. This is more noticeable at lower resolutions, and we'll come back to this in just a minute. The pros for specular are that edge artifacts are less apparent. They are there, but it's a dark edge and it's much less noticeable. And we have full control over the dielectric F0 in the specular map. For the cons, we have that it can be more susceptible to incorrect values being used. It also utilizes more texture memory with two RGB maps, which is the diffuse and specular map, and one grayscale map, which is the glossiness map. And finally, it can be more confusing for those new to PBR as it uses the same terminology as non-PBR workflows, but it requires different data. For example, a diffuse texture you created for a blend func shader will not work as a diffuse texture for a PBR shader. The same with the specular map. Even though they have the same names, they are not compatible. So now let's take a more detailed look at what I was referring to with this edge artifacts. So here we have two planes, and we're currently viewing this using a metal rough shader here in Substance Painter. So the plane on the left has a good texel density, and this plane on the right has a poor texel density. So let's take a look at what I mean by that. So here I'm just going to drop this here into my 3D, 2D view, and let's just focus here on the plane with the good texel density. This here is showing my UV view, and you can see that the polygon is mapped to the full 0 to 1 space. Now, if we take a look at the bad density example, so here I'll just select this texture set. Let's just scroll over here to take a look at this plane. You can see that its UVs are very small within the 0 to 1 space, which means that it's allocating a very small amount of the texture's resolution to the polygon face. And that is where this edge artifact is really going to become apparent. So let's drop back to our 3D view and take a look at this. So I'll zoom in, and you can see that here we have this red, which is the dielectric or the non-metal, and at the border edges of where it's meeting this metal surface, you can see that in the metal rough workflow, we're starting to get this white fringe right where these two different materials are meeting. Now, like I said, with the texel density being very low, this is what we're going to get. Or if we happen to have the resolution of the texture itself being very low. So now, if we just take a look at that same setup, now again, this is using metal rough, you can see that that white fringe is pretty much gone. It's actually still there. If we just zoom in really, really close, we can see that. Because no matter the size of the texture itself, the filtering that we're getting on the texture is still going to kind of bleed out a little bit of a transitional value here with these pixels, and we're still going to get that white edge. Here, if I come over to my texture set settings, and you can see that we're actually set at a 2K resolution. So I'm going to change this. Actually, I was on the density bad. Let's switch over here to the density good. This is what we're actually working with. And again, like I said, we're set at this 2K resolution. So let's drop the resolution down to say something like 512. And now you can see that this fringe is starting to become even more apparent as we lower the resolution. So even though I still have a very good density, just by lowering the texture size itself, this fringe is going to become more noticeable with the metal rough workflow. So here, let's take this back to, let's just say 1024. So now you can see that we have a little bit of this edge. And like I said, it happens when you have a very stark difference between this metal and this dielectric. So in this example, let's say that, if I want to come up with a way to kind of work around this, let's come down here to my metal. And what I could do is actually just kind of lower this reflectance value here for this metal. And you can see as I start to do this, so I'm just going to lower it here just a little bit, and you can see that this fringe starts to become, less apparent. So it's just something to be aware of if you're working with the metal rough, that this white fringe can become an issue in certain situations. So here we have the same example, except this time I'm using a specular glossiness shader here inside of Substance Painter. And we're just going to take a look at the density bad version. So again, remember that's this polygon plane here on the right. And I'm just going to zoom in, and you can see that here along the edge, it's much cleaner than what the metal rough version was able to give us. Even with this poor texel density, we don't have to worry about any edge artifacts. Now, like I said, you can still end up having a little bit of an artifact here, and it's just going to be the reverse. Sometimes you may notice that it's actually kind of a darker value, which is going to stem from the diffuse texture actually having black as a value for the areas denoted as full metal. Here in this case, you may notice this says base color. That's just because, like I said before, Painter doesn't officially support the spec gloss workflow, so we're using base color here as the diffuse. So don't let that confuse you. Just notice again, like I said, I am using black here for the diffuse for areas that are denoted as raw metal. So like I said, you could end up seeing kind of a dark value around the edges, but as you see here, it's not a problem, and it looks very clean even at this low density range. If we just kind of zoom over really quickly to take a look at the version that has the maximized texel density here, you can see again, we get a very nice clean result. Now we're going to start to talk specifically about map authoring guidelines. We are going to start with the base color map. As I said earlier, for the actual map creation, I'm going to focus on the metallic workflow. So in terms of base color, at this point, we're only talking about the albedo or diffuse reflected color, that is, the color that we see. The base color needs to be devoid of lighting information. We're not going to bake any lighting data into the map, such as ambient occlusion. Now, we can have an exception for micro occlusion. Think of a wood material where we have some fine grain and these areas are too detailed to be picked up in the ambient occlusion, so we can possibly augment these areas in the base color. With albedo, the dark and light ranges are what is important. So with dark values, we should not go below 30 sRGB, and if we want to be more strict about this, then we can set the value to be no dark values below 50 sRGB. Again, we can have an exception to this in regards to micro occlusion. Bright values should not go above 240 sRGB. So we should never have a pure black or pure white value in the base color map. In this example, you can see the rock material we will be creating in the Unity course. Notice that the albedo for the rock and dirt is fairly bright in tone. I haven't added any black shadow values in the large cracks. When we look at the rendered material in the viewport, you can see that the occlusion is coming from the AO map input and light and shadow from the environment. With PBR, you should always think of the map channels working together as a full material. The albedo just represents the diffuse reflected color component, and when authored within the correct bright and dark ranges, the albedo value will yield a correct result. So here in Substance Painter, we're going to take a look at a practical example on how we can author correct albedo values for our base color. So what we're going to look at here is this material. So I have this material that represents this rubber and this carbon fiber area. And I'm using the same material value for this. And you can see that if we take a look at the base color channel, this is the value that we have. Now, if I'm trying to author a material like this, I may think, well, I need this to be a dark value, so I'm just going to come over here to my value and just set this to be a dark value. Because in my mind of what I'm thinking, oh, this is a dark rubber, it needs to be a dark value. So I may, typically set a value something, say, like this. Now, what I'm doing thus far is I'm using my mind to kind of visualize what I think the albedo value is just from looking at a material as reference. And you can get into trouble when you start to just think or using your perception and feelings of what you think a material might be, because in actuality, the albedo values for material are actually much brighter than we tend to think of them in our mind. So this is the value that I set. Let's just jump back over to the material rendering mode and take a look at what I have. So right here, I can already start to see that it starts to appear that this value that I have chosen for this material is a bit too dark. Now, maybe in this rendering environment, it still looks okay. It may still look passable. But we can start to run into an issue if I start to change my environment, like I said. So maybe I switch to a different lighting setup, and now all of a sudden this dark value that I created is going to start to yield an even more incorrect result. And so typically what we've done as artists in traditional workflows is, we've added these maps into our scene, we've set up a lighting, we've changed the lighting, and then we run into that issue where, well, now it looks too dark, I need to increase my light intensity to get this material to work, and so on. But that really goes against the principles of PBR, where you're creating consistent values in artwork that's going to be or look correct in all lighting situations. So to help illustrate how I've chosen an incorrect value here for this material, I'm going to utilize a tool that I have called the Metal Rough Validate. Now, this is a Substance Painter filter, and it also ships with Substance Designer, and it's a tool that allows you to visualize ranges within your base color for albedo as well as metal reflectance, and it'll display a heat map that lets you see where these ranges are no longer valid. So for instance, let me just enable the filter, and I can start to see that here in this area for that material, the value is kind of giving me this kind of orange, kind of moving its way towards red, which means this value is in danger of being a bit too dark. So let's take a look at the actual settings here for this filter, and you can see that my validation mode here is set to albedo, and we're using the albedo dark range threshold of 30 sRGB like I mentioned previously. So here, let me go back to this base color and let's just change the color. Let's just make it a little bit darker. Let's say that I chose just a color a bit darker. And you can see that now it's starting to move into red, letting me know that, okay, now I'm really using an incorrect value here. So with this, I'm just going to disable the filter and let's take a look at what we have. So here you can see that this is really starting to look very dark. And so again, what I'm going to want to do is just enable my filter. I can see that I've chosen a value based on what I've set here for my filter. So remember, we've said that we don't want to have any dark ranges below 30 sRGB. And so now we see that, well, we do have ranges that are below that threshold. So let's go back to our base color. Let's come over here to our color picker and let's just start to lift the value until we start to get this into the correct range. So here we've moved this all the way into the green. So now let's take a look at the result that we get. So here I'll just disable the filter. And so this here gives us the correct value range. So now I know that this value I've chosen for this material is in the correct range for an albedo value, and it's going to work within different lighting situations. Here you can see a side-by-side comparison of the albedo values that we chose. So we see the correct and the incorrect. And now it's more apparent that by choosing the albedo value for that dark material, which represents the rubber and that carbon fiber, by making sure that that dark value fits within the specific albedo ranges, we get a much more natural result in the render as shown here in the correct version. So now let's look at a more complex example, and I'm going to add a layer of dirt. So here in my layer stack, I have this dirt effect, and I'm just going to enable this. And so notice that we have the dirt, but it's only falling on dielectric surfaces. So on the metal, we don't have any dirt. Now I'm going to talk about how the dirt would affect the metal later in the video. So for now, we're only focusing on how it's going to affect these dielectric surfaces. So we have our dirt effect, and the value that we're choosing here for this dirt color is already pretty dark. So let's take a look at what the validator has to say about it. So we'll enable this, and you can see, sure enough, we have a lot of red areas within our values. So let's do this. Let's take this dirt layer, and I'm just going to duplicate it so that we can do a before and after comparison. And I'm going to disable the dirt layer below it. And let's go over to the value, and here, let's just choose to lift the actual value. So here I'm just lifting the value until we're in the green, which I know that from my validation settings here. Again, let's just take a look. I know that I've lifted all the values to be higher than 30 sRGB. Let's turn off the validation node and take a look at the dirt that we have now. So this now gives us a much more natural and realistic albedo color, so diffuse reflected color, for this surface. So here is the after, and let's take a look at what we had in the before. Again, with these albedo values being very dark, we get this unnatural look to the actual diffuse reflected color that we're getting. Now we're going to talk about the second component to the base color, which is metal reflectance. Since the metallic map is used as a mask to denote areas of metal and non-metal, we will also discuss the metallic map here as well. The reflectance range for metal is high at 70 to 100% specular. This maps to a range of 180 to 255 sRGB. Some metals absorb light at different wavelengths. For example, gold absorbs blue light at the high frequency end of the visible spectrum, so it appears yellow as a result. This means that the reflectance value for some metals can be tinted. The reflectance value is scientifically measured. Here, you don't arbitrarily pick a value. You must use the real-world measured value. In Painter, if you look at the Materials tab, you'll find several materials that are set with the correct real-world values. Here in Painter, the Materials tab, we have the materials with all the correct values. So here in the search field, I'll just type in metal, and here we have the metal, again with the appropriate metal reflectance values for different metals. These materials are also substances, so they have additional parameters. I like to use the uniform material, so I'll just start to type in uniform, and here you'll see that we have things such as uniform cobalt, uniform titanium. If we take a look at this, here I'm just going to quickly create a fill layer, and then apply uniform titanium to the layer. If I take a look at the material tab, since this is a raw metal as set by the 1.0 value here for the metallic, the base color represents the metal reflectance value. And here we have the scientifically measured value. So you don't have to worry about finding charts and looking these up. These material presets are all available for you here in Painter as well as Substance Designer. Any PBR substance material that you use is always going to contain the appropriate real-world measured values. So here we are in Substance Designer, and let's take a look at how we can access these metal reflectance values. So here we have our PBR utilities, and I'm starting to build up a material, and I need some metal reflectance values. Here I've set this material to have a metallic value of pure white, so this means I'm making a raw metal. So I'm going to grab the PBR metal reflectance node and just drag and drop this here into my graph, and then apply this here to my base color. And so if I select this node, you can see that for metal color, I have a list of several metals that I can choose from. So for example, here I have gold. I can set this to aluminum, titanium, cobalt, platinum, and so on. So you can utilize the PBR metal reflectance node to quickly set the real-world measured value for various metal materials. Also, we have the base material node. This is the easiest way to quickly create custom PBR materials. So I'm going to take this node and just drag and drop that here into my graph. And I'm going to apply this here to my output. So I'll just right click and choose View in 3D View. And now I can come over here to this node, and you can notice that I can actually change between spec gloss or metal rough. So here I'll keep this at metal rough. For my material preset, I have several presets. So again, if I wanted to choose gold, I can simply just choose that preset. It's important to understand that dirt or oxidation affects reflectance values. For example, some metals can be corroded, and the corrosion changes the material, and these corroded areas are to be treated as a dielectric layer. Looking at rust, the areas of rust should be set to black in the metallic map to denote non-metal. The reflectance value for the rust is then set to the default 4% value for the F0. With the metallic workflow, this is hard-coded in the shader, and we don't have to worry about it. This means the rust in the base color is simply authored as diffuse reflected color. Also, with painted metal, it should be treated as full dielectric, as the paint is a dielectric layer on top of the metal. If the paint is scratched away, then it would reveal the raw metal underneath. This is another example of blending materials. Here in Painter, I'll showcase an example where this area we have a painted metal. So let's take a look at the actual metallic map. So here you can see that in this area here that represents a painted metal, the value is black, whereas the raw metal is white. So now I'm going to enable a generator that produces some edge wear and scratches. Here we have an effect of this painted layer being scratched away to reveal the raw metal underneath. So with these generators, let's take a look at how it affects the metallic map. Notice now that for the scratch areas and the grunge around the edges, it's been set to white to denote that we are now showing raw metal. So here we have a blend between raw metal as white and dielectric as black, which again is actually a mix of two materials. We have a raw metal underneath and a dielectric paint layer on top. Some effects like dirt on metal can have more pronounced transitional states, where the metal map is no longer just black and white, but also contains some transitional grayscale values to indicate the blend of two materials, such as in the case of a dirt layer on top of metal. For the metal map, when you have values lower than 235 sRGB, then the reflectance value in the base color needs to be lowered, as you are indicating a dielectric instead of a raw material. So here in Painter, we're going to look at a practical example of how I can add dirt on top of this metal, as we discussed earlier in the video. But first, let's check and make sure that my metal reflectance value is correct. I'm going to come over to my validation layer, and I'm going to enable this. And let's just check the filter settings. So notice the validation mode is now set to metal, and for my reflectance range, I have this set to 70 to 100% reflective. Also notice that I have red in the areas of metallic. What this is indicating is that I have denoted this as raw metal, so it's full white in the metallic map, and I can show that here by just going to the metallic map. So here we have this as full white. However, the actual reflectance value that we're choosing for this base color is too low. So here we'll go back to material mode, and I'll just scroll down here to where I actually have this set. So let's take a look at this base value. So the value is not giving me this 70 to 100% specular range. It's not falling within that percentage. So here, to fix this, I can just come over to my color picker, and I'm just going to take my value, and I'm just going to start to increase it. So as I start to increase this, you can see that we can now push this into the green, which means that this value that I have now chosen is going to place me within that 70 to 100% range. Now, one thing I'd like to point out about this color picker, if you've been confused as I've been showing this, when you are using the color picker in Substance Painter, whenever you choose values here, you are choosing these values in sRGB space. However, Substance Painter will numerically show that value as linear. So this value that I'm looking at, this is actually a linear value. So I've chosen the color here in sRGB space, and the actual numerical RGB values are presented to me in linear space. Now, if you're using Substance Designer will allow you to choose the colors here in sRGB just as you can in Painter. However, it also just displays numeric value in sRGB as well. So that's just something to be aware of when you're trying to validate and check these ranges. So like I said, we've picked this range. I've used a value of 0.542. So just to demonstrate how this comes out to be the correct percentage, I've taken the linear value and I've converted it to sRGB, so we get 193. And then I found the percentage of that, and it comes out to be around 75.6% specular. But the best part about all this is I don't really have to worry about all these numbers and values and all that, because if I'm just using the materials here from Substance Painter, I know they're going to be the correct values, and if I'm getting values elsewhere and I want to validate them, I can use the validation filter and I can just visually just see it go from red to green. So again, I don't have to know a bunch of math, it's just I can just utilize these tools and get myself set up with the correct values with little to no effort. At this point, I've been using a metal reflectance value that I made up just to demonstrate the point. However, like I said earlier in the video, that's something we definitely don't want to do. So before we continue, I'm going to make sure that I just use one of our preset values. So here I'm just going to use one of our metal presets. I know now that my reflectance values are all set like they need to be. And so now I'm good to go and I don't have to worry about anything. So here, let's scroll up to the top. Let's turn off our validation filter. And I'm going to come over here and enable this kind of dirt filter. So here I'm going to enable this dirt, and now I have dirt on the metal. And so now, since we've added this dirt, we want to make sure that it's accounted for in the metallic map itself. So let's take a look at what we have. So here I'm just going to go into the metallic map and notice that it's still pure white. So as far as the shader is concerned, with the authoring that I've done thus far, is that I have a raw metal. It actually has some dirt on top of it, but as far as the shader is concerned, there is no dirt. It's all being treated as raw metal. So I have this dielectric dirt layer, which is not accurately being accounted for. Let's take a look at what happens when we enable our validation filter so that we can see a more visual representation of this. So right off the bat, we've got some red here. And again, what this red means is that the metal reflectance values that we have in our base color are not the appropriate range for this raw metal that we've indicated. Here, let's come over to our viewer settings, and for our view, let's just switch this to base color. And I'm going to turn off the validation filter so we can look at the base color. So here you can see that we do have the metal reflectance value, but we also have this dark value, which is the dirt. Again though, if we look at our metal, it's not being accounted for. So what we need to do is we need to check to see how that dirt layer is affecting our metallic channel. So first, I'm going to go into material mode. I'm going to enable my filter. I'm going to come down to dirt, and sure enough, if I look at the metallic channel for this dirt, it's set all the way to 1. So I'm basically saying, hey, this dirt is metallic, which it isn't. It's actually dielectric. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to just decrease this value. And you can see that as I start to decrease this value, we start to get a green validation. So as I said earlier in the video, that if you have any metallic values that are less than 235, when we're talking about 0 to 255 in the range of a metallic map, here let's go over to our metallic map so that we can see this. And just to get a more clear view, let's go over to our post effects and let's just disable this. So now we can really see the values that we have. So I'll zoom in and you can see that now here in our metallic map, we have some of these transitional gray values. We have some areas that are less than 235, so not full white. Our validation node here is going to show this as green. So let's turn this off and take a look at what the effect looks like now. So here we have the appropriate setup for including this dirt here onto our metal. Again, here's our metal map. We have some transitional values. We have some values that are less than white. If we jump over here to the actual base color now, again, we also have these values that are darker than the metal reflectance value should. So now we've balanced everything out. And again, like I said, we get this correct result. So we can also play with this as well. So, I have this thin dirt layer and some of the raw metal underneath is kind of showing through. They're kind of really thin, blending together like this. So that's why I have a mix here on my metallic. As I start to drop this down further, you can see that, we get, a little bit of a different effect. It's kind of hard to see here in this video, but because of the filter itself that I'm using for my dirt, here, let's go and take a look at that metallic channel again. I'm just flipping through my channels. You can see now it's more pronounced, of course, but here we get a little bit more accurate result because where the dirt's really collecting, so it's more opaque and you're not really going to see any metal, it's actually black here in the metallic map. And then areas where the dirt is more thin and we're going to see some of that raw metal underneath, we've got these, lighter gray transitional areas. So leaving this here at probably black, I can actually increase it maybe a little bit here just to show a little bit less opaque areas here of this dirt. And we'll jump back over to our material mode. And again, this is the kind of effect that I get. So this dirt on metal. Something else that we need to check for in our dirt is that we've accounted for the metallic channel correctly, but maybe our albedo is incorrect. So let's jump back over to our validate node here and let's switch this validation mode to albedo. Also notice here my metal reflectance range in this case has been dropped to 60. So like I said, 70 to 100, but those don't have to be like, really like hard set in stone. Okay, it has to be this no matter what. So in these validation filters, there's actually kind of a buffer zone. So just like we had the buffer zone basically, or the threshold for this 30 to 50, I've got one built in here for the reflectance range as well. So in my case, I wanted just to kind of feather this a bit more, so I dropped it to 60. So you can go anywhere technically 60 to 70 all the way to 100%. So that's why this is set in this range. So like I said, we've dropped to albedo. Let's enable this guy now. So we're validating albedo and maybe a little bit dark. So let's come over here to our dirt. Let's come over to here to the value and let's just lift the value a little bit. So now you can see that I've changed that. Let's turn this guy off. Now I have a correctly authored PBR map where I have my raw metal. I've added some dirt on top. I know that the dirt is appropriately being accounted for in the metallic map, and I also know that the dirt's albedo, or its diffused reflected color, is set correctly as well. Now we're going to talk about dielectrics. We've covered the diffused reflected color, or albedo aspect, so now we'll focus on reflectivity. Dielectrics reflect a smaller amount of light than metals. Common dielectrics are around 2 to 5% reflective, which maps to 40 to 75 sRGB. The exception to this is gemstones, which are around 8% and higher. When light hits a surface straight on or perpendicularly, which is a 0-degree angle, there is a percentage of that light that is reflected back as specular. Using the index of refraction for a surface, you can derive the amount that is reflected back, and this is known as F0. It's the F0 reflectance value that we are concerned with in regards to authoring textures. F0 will reflect between 2 and 5% of light and 100% at grazing angles. Nonmetals will have a grayscale value for F0, and the range doesn't differ drastically, with gemstones being the exception as they have higher values. In fact, when altered by roughness, the actual value differences in common dielectrics can be hard to see. The Substance PBR shader is mapped to a range of 0.0 to 0.08 linear, as 0 is needed to represent air. And here in this chart, you can see the range for common dielectrics and how it doesn't differ drastically, as I mentioned previously. In the metallic workflow, you don't have control over the dielectric F0, as we've already mentioned. However, some implementations allow you to override this value with a specular input, as I showed with Substance Designer. Anytime your metallic map is set to black, the shader is then going to utilize this 4% reflective value for the surface that represents the non-metal. Roughness describes the microsurface detail. It's the most creative map you can author. The surface irregularities at a microscopic level cause light diffusion. Rougher surfaces will have a larger and dimmer looking highlights, while smoother surfaces will keep specular reflections focused, which can appear to look brighter or more intense, but the same amount of light is still reflected. The roughness map can be used to truly tell a story about the asset. Was it handled with care? What type of environment does it exist in? You can answer these questions through the detail you place in the roughness map. Think of scratches and dirt, fingerprints, or water stains. Nothing in the real world is perfect, and all the nuanced detail you place in the roughness map goes a long way to making incredible looking assets. So now let's look at a practical walkthrough on roughness. So here I have this asset and I'm just working with my roughness here. And as we set the roughness value to black, you can see that the surface becomes very shiny. And as we start to take our roughness value and move this towards white, the surface becomes more diffused. So this means that a value of black equals smooth and a value of white equals rough. And as I said, different workflows like the specular glossiness workflow is just the reverse of this. So with a glossiness map, black equals rough and white equals smooth. And different implementations may have the inverse of what I'm showing here. However, the principles and the concepts of what we're talking about, the data that we're working with, is actually the same. It's just inverse in how we may paint the value. So here, let's set ourselves kind of a base rough value. And notice that, if I zoom in here and I start to move my light across the scene, we can see how this rough information is kind of breaking up the light. However, it's doing this very uniformly because we're just using a simple value to create this roughness. And like I said, where the real creativity comes in is in all the nuanced data that we add into this roughness. So just to demonstrate that, let's just create a new channel here, or a new layer, and I just have this set to rough, and I'm going to set this value up a little higher. Let me just grab a dirt brush. So I'm just doing a quick search for a dirt. Here's a dirt brush, decrease my size down, and then here I'm going to start to paint a new layer of roughness on top of this. So I'll just kind of paint this in, and here as I start to just kind of rotate my light around, we can see how this dirt that I'm painting here with this roughness, how it's affecting the highlight here. So we're getting a bit more variation to the way this light is being broken up on the surface, and in turn that gives us a much more creative or realistic look to the map that we're creating. So here again, maybe I'll come in and start to type in let's just grab some scratches here. So we'll grab these scratches, and here let's drop this value down again, and then I can start to paint some scratches here into the surface. We'll kind of zoom in and just kind of move our light around, and we can see how, this again is just affecting the overall distribution here of this highlight as the light is being broken up across the surface. Here we'll just drop in and take a look, and here's the rough information that we're creating. So here you can see that we have this uniform value. Here we have this more white value here. This was our dirt, so this is more rough. And now I'm kind of scratching away some of that dirt here, and now you see the scratches are more black here, so it means it's going to be more smooth or shiny here within our map. And so here you can see the different variation that we're getting and the result that this has here on the render. So here's another example. Here I'm going to take this layer and I'm going to remove it. And here I'm just going to add another layer on top that's only going to target roughness. So I'm going to add just a little bit of extra detail here. And so for this roughness channel, I'm actually just going to use one of these procedural textures. So I'll utilize this texture and I'm going to scale it across the surface. Now I don't really like the intense values that I'm getting here, so I'm just going to add a levels control, and I'm going to drop this here to roughness. And then I'm just going to adjust the tone of that procedural here by adjusting my output black and white. So I get just, a bit more of a subtle effect here. And so now that I have this layer, I'd like to have a little bit more dirt kind of collecting in kind of the occluded areas. So here I'm just going to add a mask here, and I'm going to derive that mask based on a dirt generator. And so here I'm going to drop over to my roughness map itself, and I'm going to take a look at some of my values here. So let's take maybe my grunge amount and just kind of drop this down and increase my dirt level amount. Here I'll increase my contrast somewhat. And so here you can see that I'm starting to collect a bit more of this dirt here in kind of like these occluded areas. So now we'll just drop back over into our material mode. And here, let me just kind of take a look at the asset. Let's just kind of zoom out. Let's move our light around. You can see that we get, a much more varied result here to our roughness. Again, I can drop back to that base layer, and I still think it's just a bit too contrasty in the balance between my rough and smooth. So what I'm going to do here is just increase my roughness overall a bit. And so here we get just a very subtle effect here on our roughness. But like I said, it goes a very long way to creating a more detailed asset because we're adding a lot of surface irregularities to the map, and that helps to break up the lighting across the surface. And so here's the roughness map that we're working with thus far. So this brings us to the end of this video. We've covered a lot of information as a basic overview. Here, I'd like to recap the key factors of PBR. Energy conservation. This states that a reflected ray is never brighter than the value it had when it first hit the surface. The F0 reflectance value has minimal change for most common dielectrics and falls within a range of 2 to 5%. The F0 for metals is a high value ranging from 70 to 100% specular. Specular intensity is controlled through the BRDF, roughness or glossiness map, and the F0 reflectance value. And finally, lighting calculations are computed in linear space. We didn't cover this in the video, but you should understand that maps that have gamma encoded values will be computed in linear space. Think of it like this. If it's the color you see, such as with base color, diffuse, specular, then they are to be treated as sRGB, which means they are linearized by the shader. Maps that control data, such as roughness, AO, and metallic, are to be treated as linear input. Some implementations will handle this for you, such as with Substance Designer and Painter, as well as Unity. As I said, this video served as a basic overview of PBR and map guidelines. If you'd like a more in-depth resource, check our 2-volume PBR guide. It's free and you can download it from our website. Volume 1 is a comprehensive look at PBR theory, and Volume 2 is all about map creation guidelines and best practices.